Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, The BRADS Blueprint, Anti-Displacement Strategies for Equitable Redevelopment. My name is Lujane Altawara, and I'm a Senior Program Associate with the Center for Creative Land Recycling. And we are so excited to be here with you today to have this important conversation. This webinar is being hosted in collaboration with the Brownfields Revitalization Anti-Displacement Strategies Program at UMass Dartmouth. And today we'll explore how the BRADS program can be used to build equity, stability, and resilience into your redevelopment plans from the start. You'll hear from Nefeli and Devin, and you'll also be able to hear about case studies, and we'll be sure to share real strategies and lessons learned and tools that you can take back to your own work and incorporate into the redevelopment process. And before we dive into the content of this webinar, I'd just like to get some housekeeping out of the way. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the CCLR and BRADS program website and YouTube channel and CCLR YouTube channel within the next week or so. You'll also receive a follow-up email with the slides and recording within the next week or so. There will also be a Q&A portion at the end of this webinar, so we ask that you put any questions that may arise in the specific Q&A box, and then any other comments in the regular chat box. I see that Devin already put in the chat box. If you all would like to introduce yourselves in the chat, feel free to. Perfect. Okay, and I would like to give the speakers, the presenters, a chance to introduce themselves. So Nefeli, take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nefeli Bombotti. I'm an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering at UMass Dartmouth, and I'm also the principal investigator for the BRADS program. And I would also like to introduce my collaborator, Kelly Kinahan from the Florida State University, who unfortunately cannot be with us today, so I'll be covering for her due to the unfortunate events Florida State. And then I'll pass it on to Devin.
Thank you, Nefeli. Hi, everyone. My name is Devin Rainwater. I'm a program manager at the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and I work closely with communities in Region 10 and Region 9.
Great. Thank you, Devin. Thank you, Nefeli. I've already introduced myself, so we can just dive right into it. So our agenda for today will include going over some key terms. We'll go over the connection between anti-displacement and brownfields. Nefeli will present on the BRADS program. She'll also share some case studies and tailored anti-displacement strategies. And then towards the end, we'll also provide information on how to get in touch with both CCLR and the BRADS program. And as mentioned earlier, we'll also have time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. So to go over some key terms that we'll be using a lot throughout the webinar, I'll get us started with just some simple terminology. What defines a brownfield, what some pollutants are, and also what some examples of brownfields are. So as indicated on the slide, a brownfield is a vacant or underutilized property with potential presence of a hazardous substance or a contaminant, which complicates its reuse. It's really important for us to emphasize that there only needs to be some perceived presence of contamination. You may not know for sure, but if you perceive that there is, then it is considered a brownfield. This point is important to keep in mind because a site does not need to have known contamination in order to access funding and various brownfield resources. It's also really important for us to acknowledge that there is a disproportionate burden of brownfields in disadvantaged and low-income communities. And that's largely due to the fact that when industrialization first began, there were no real environmental regulations against pollution, and land use laws drove polluting industries to be located in neighborhoods with more people of color and lower incomes. These polluting industries have caused long-lasting impacts by introducing contaminants and pollutants such as asbestos, leaking fuel tanks, and uncontrolled wastewater, lead paint, PCBs, etc., which unfortunately does lead to the creation of brownfields. So brownfields can and do exist everywhere, and land recycling can help mitigate these environmental injustices by centering the communities being directly affected by brownfields and ensuring they're aware of the possibilities of equitable redevelopment. I also wanted to provide some examples of brownfields. So they can include, but are definitely not limited to, closed gas stations, agricultural sites, abandoned factories, oil drilling sites. The definition of brownfields is quite broad and it can seem pretty overwhelming, but fortunately, which we'll go over today, there is a plethora of resources available that can kind of help you with your redevelopment process, and ensure that you're going about it in an equitable manner. I know that I kind of, listed a lot of bad things about brownfields and how how affected they can be. But brownfields can also provide a chance to turn things around within your community. They can mitigate extreme weather by conserving open space and increasing resilient infrastructure. This could include, developing more open space and green space within your communities. It can provide more housing, more affordable housing, and more public parks to live and play. And it can also clean up contamination that could impact public health. And it can also really create jobs for community members and develop workforce and really strengthen your economy within your community. And now I'll pass it over to Devin, who will go over the connection between brownfields and anti-displacement.
Awesome. Thanks, Lou Jane. So brownfields can be wonderful opportunities for a community to add or improve amenities in the area. But brownfields may also lead to involuntary displacement and gentrification if proper measures are not put in place early on in a project. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. Involuntary displacement is the forced or coerced movement of a person or people away from their home. And there are multiple points in a project lifespan where this displacement can happen. But two key points that I'm going to cover today, they can be during project construction and or the planning process, where an occupied space might be cleared for cleanup and development. And it can also happen after the development of the reuse occurs through the process of gentrification. So during this process, the character of a low-income urban area is changed by updating or improving local amenities such as public transit, parks, restaurants, businesses, housing, and more, causing wealthier residents to move in while displacing the current residents. So of course, brownfields can be a great way to improve or update an area, but proper measures need to be put in place to ensure that the updated amenities or added amenities directly benefit the existing residents. So before we get into some more discussion on displacement and strategies for mitigating it, before we hear from Nefeli, I wanted to situate us with a short discussion on redlining to kind of talk through the history of the conditions of gentrification. So many of us might know this term, or maybe we've seen a map like this one. This one is of San Francisco and was created by the federal government's Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, between 1935 and 1940. And these maps of cities like San Francisco represented an area's supposed mortgage security. And this was expressed through assigned grade levels that were represented by colors and letters. So as you can see on this map, grade A neighborhoods are represented by the color green, and they were deemed safe for lenders and banks when handing out home loans. Grade D neighborhoods were considered hazardous and were often avoided by lenders, and that is the red spots on the map. Race and ethnicity were direct factors in the HOLC's grading decision, and people living in the red areas on the map were primarily working class, low-income communities of color. So redlining was a practice of institutionalized racism, and it severely limited access to buying homes and accumulating wealth for significant parts of the population. I also encourage you to check out CCLR's webinar on redlining called Redlining to Greenlining, where we could go into this in more detail. But here's a little bit of a selected portion of HOLC descriptions for the different grade levels on that map. So you can see that grade A was considered the best, B is still desirable, C is definitely declining, and D is hazardous. And so if you kind of skim through these descriptions of the different grade levels as well, you can see that race and ethnicity and class were played major factors in this determination. So the history of redlining has really created the conditions for gentrification to flourish. So due to redlining, low-income communities of color in cities or urban areas have not had the same opportunities to accumulate wealth through property ownership as primarily white communities have. And this inequity persists today. Redlining practices of the past have created a purposeful and institutionalized housing insecurity and instability for the communities that are in those red zones. So when potentially contaminated brownfield sites in these areas are redeveloped into housing or parks or grocery stores, property values rise and rents rise while wages in the area stay the same, and already vulnerable low-income folks are forced to move out, even if they have been there for years or their families have been there for years. The areas deemed grade A or B, the green and blue areas on the map, remain higher property value and essentially stand as exclusionary areas where lower income folks are unable to move due to the high cost of living. So on this map, you can see the areas overlaid with purple are the areas that are currently or recently gentrified in San Francisco. And 87% of the neighborhoods that are undergoing gentrification were once redlined as hazardous areas. So you can see that by the overlap of the purple and the red on this map. So why should we consider displacement? We're encouraging you to consider displacement from the very start of your project all the way to the end. And we're doing this because gentrification, it creates a shortage of affordable housing and necessary health services, which then lead to increased houselessness and decreased health of residents that are forced to move. So this can create major issues for communities that are experiencing gentrification. As I said earlier, all of the green grade A zones are still exclusionary zones where displaced residents can't move to. So then the question becomes, where are displaced residents supposed to live? So brownfields can also be an opportunity to, improve displacement, add anti-displacement measures into your projects so that this does not happen. Plus, if you want to score higher on your EPA Brownfield grant applications, your plans need to show your plans for mitigating displacement during your project. So with all of this, I want to say it's also great that technical assistance providers are ready to help you along the way in organizing your anti-displacement plans. So if you are in regions 9 or 10, so the Center for Creative Land Recycling is your technical assistance to Brownfields provider or your TAB provider. And if you're outside of regions 9 or 10, CCLR can also help you to identify and connect with your TAB provider. CCLR and the other tabs can support your project development, work planning, reviewing your Brownfield grant applications, and working with you to develop an effective community engagement plan to increase community input in your project and decrease displacement as a result of your Brownfields project. So we can also, coordinate with and get you connected to the great team at the BRADS program through this webinar as well, of course. So I will pass it over to Nefeli to share more about the BRADS program.
Fantastic. Thank you both. And I think it's so important, Devin, that you mentioned that redlining, right, is directly related to some of the issues that we see today with cities that are gentrifying and residents are being displaced. So thank you very much for bringing this up. Now, I would like to mention a few things about our program. We started actually back in November of 2023. We are a coalition of 3 universities that are working together towards finding anti-displacement strategies to minimize the risks of displacement in brownfields communities. So UMass Dartmouth, the University of Louisville, and also Florida State University, all of us work together towards preserving our communities and also, protecting, the existing residents and businesses from potential displacement risks. So our program is structured in a way where we actually combine research components with technical assistance. So it has, our program has this duality of having the scholarly work where we actually look at different, literature studies. We also do our own studies, with our research, within our research teams. But at the same time, we also provide technical assistance to communities across the nation. So our technical assistance program is open to basically all communities within the US, as long as, of course, there is a brownfields project or they're interested in starting a new brownfields program. Next slide. So I would like to introduce our team. As I mentioned, it's a coalition of 3 universities that are actually, funded by, by the EPA, and my collaborators are Florida State, Kelly Kinahan, I mentioned that she couldn't be here today, and also Professor Lauren Hebrely from the Department of Sociology at the University of Louisville. And we also have an affiliated researcher from the University of Maine, Taylor Lange, who is also, contributing to this work. And together with the team of our students, all of us, right, from the engineering perspective, the planning perspective, right, the sociology, and also incorporating some of the economic aspects, right, all of us work together towards actually this mission. So at this point, I would like to actually get your perception, your perspective, right, on what best reflects your view on how brownfields redevelopment is actually related to displacement. So we have a couple of options here, for you to choose. First of all, there's no anticipated displacement, right? The brownfield site is currently vacant, so nobody's there to be displaced. The redevelopment, right, may raise property values, leading to higher rents and displacing long-time residents. Or on the other side, the redevelopment creates jobs, which can actually reduce displacement by boosting the local economic stability. Neighborhood improvements attract wealthier residents, which can lead to gentrification and potential displacement. Or, perhaps, you're here to learn, you're not sure yet. So would like to get your thoughts on the topic. So as the answers are coming in, a lot of people thinking about that redevelopment raises property values, which leads to higher rents and could displace long-time residents. And also the fact that improvements can attract wealthier residents, right? That this can lead to gentrification. And close the poll so that you can also see the results. So it's actually great to see that nobody responded the very first potential answer that there's no anticipated displacement because the site is currently vacant. And I think this is a great indicator here, for our audience, because when we started this program, I actually want to share this with you. When we started this program, we started reviewing previous applications from different brownfields grants that people had submitted back in 2023, and that was actually one of the most common answers, that there is no displacement because nobody actually lives at the site, right? Nobody, I mean, the site is vacant. So I'm glad to see that actually we've made a lot of progress since then. So yes, you answered correctly that most of the main, let's say, causes, right, related to potential gentrification and displacement has to do with attracting wealthier residents, but also, right, but also like leading to higher rents, right? Stop sharing so that we can go to the next slide. And that's actually what I'd like to start from, like, connecting the two, although, I mean, the majority of the audience actually has figured this out, right? How is brownfields redevelopment, and in general, because that is a little bit broader than brownfields redevelopment, it actually expands to any type of infrastructure upgrades. We've seen, of course, gentrification and displacement of people that extends beyond like a brownfield site, right? So, but for the purposes of the brownfields programs, of course, right, the environmental cleanup of the site, the improvement of infrastructure that has to do perhaps with public transit, housing development, and of course commercial investment, right, can basically start, right, generating what? Well, attracting, first of all, new residents that may be wealthier, right, that have higher income, but also could have different demographics, right? So they're residents of a different, essentially, racial makeup. They may be different from, from the existing community. And at the same time, as this influx, right, of new residents, right, this is a cycle that we see actually that is a continuous cycle of increasing property values, right, and rents, and then you attract like new residents, and that goes continuously, right, on and on. And that can actually trigger gentrification, right? Which means what? Well, first of all, that housing affordability may be reduced, and this could mean that some of the low-income families, renters, or like existing community members have to move out because they can no longer afford to live there. Right? Which is, of course, is a main concern, right? We're doing all this effort to redevelop, the brownfield sites in order for the existing residents to capture the benefits. If that doesn't happen, then, first of all, as Devin mentioned, where do this, where does this population go, right? Where do the displacement residents go? And what is the point of actually, doing that? I wanted to share here, actually, this is a previous study that looked at gentrification within, different cities across the US, and it's called Shifting Neighborhoods, Gentrification and Cultural Displacement in American Cities, and that was actually conducted back in 2019 from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. And as you see here in this map, and I think that's a very important thing to actually notice, gentrification, right, in the neighborhoods that are gentrified are mostly, right, located in major cities, right? So what we see from the study is actually that 7 cities account for 50% of the gentrified areas within the US, and those are New York, LA, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Baltimore, San Diego, and also Chicago. However, besides the major cities, right, where gentrification is more intense, At the same time, we see gentrification concerns in other areas, right? In smaller cities, suburban areas as well. And actually, we noticed that through our technical assistance program, where we have larger cities participating, but also smaller towns and suburban areas, there are concerns there are concerns even in areas where they're not a major city, they're not Boston, right? You still see a lot of concerns with regards to gentrification. And I'll walk you through of how we actually identify those concerns. But the important point to actually, keep here from the slide is that gentrification is not only an issue that we see in major cities, but other smaller communities, suburban areas may also experience, right, gentrification due again to infrastructure upgrades or different changes within the community, and it's important to pay attention to. Besides the spatial aspect of gentrification, urban versus suburban, that we went over in the previous map, here I think it's very important to also get an understanding of who may be at risk, mostly at risk within your community. So we have this actually a graph here that is adapted from another project. It's called Uprooted Project, Understanding Gentrification and Displacement, because I think it actually captures the different vulnerable populations in a way that is very clear. So when we look at a community and we identify which groups, which part of the population may be more at risk, the number one group that we mainly focus on is actually the renters. So it's the central graph that you have, you see there on the graph. So renters, right, are actually mostly vulnerable when it comes to displacement. And that we can explain. Like, why is this happening? Of course, the changes in the rent, right, as you see, the gentrification force is triggered, right? The property values may go up. The rents will directly respond to that change. And then, the renters have actually, they are impacted the most. So this is the number one group to actually, pay attention to, especially if you have areas with higher percentages of renters. But of course, other groups, people of color, people with a lower educational attainment, without a bachelor's degree, lower income families, they're also, of course, vulnerable to displacement. And if you look at the different groups, sometimes you also see that there is a high correlation between those different groups, right? For example, the people of color, right, may be also highly correlated with low-income populations within the area. So we see that, some of those groups are actually, some of these variables are interconnected. But one thing to actually keep, from this slide, if you're interested in, doing this kind of, assessment of understanding where the risks may be within your community, the number one group to look into is actually the renters. And of course, then look at where you have more people of color, low-income families, where they may also be impacted. And I mentioned that, doing that assessment, when I refer to assessment, I basically refer to an understanding of how different areas within the community may be changing. And I'm referring to actually, the indicators of neighborhood change, because these are the indicators that we use to basically identify where the changes are happening. So, as we were going through, the development of the methodology with the rest of the team, we actually went through a lot of different studies that have proposed methodologies to capture gentrification, to capture, displacement risk, and there's a lot out there. And for us, I mean, as we were selecting, which methodology to actually adopt and also expand, modify so that we capture the brownfields context, we chose to adopt the BATES methodology, which which integrates different indicators. And most importantly, I think one of the most important reasons of why we actually selected this approach was, first of all, because it had a racial component that was integrated into the methodology versus other studies where that racial component was not included. So the main, let's say, assessment was conducted by just looking at the low-income populations. Here, it's very important to actually include that racial component and look at the changes within the demographics of the community. But at the same time, it's also an established methodology that has been implemented for the city of Portland in the previous years. So to walk you through, those different indicators and why they're important. First of all, we can basically group them under 3 different categories that start from examining where is the housing vulnerability. So we look at what is happening with the median gross rent, first of all. What is happening with the percentage of renters, right? What is the percentage of renters within the community? And a very important indicator, what is the rent? What percentage is the rent, right, compared to their income, right? So mainly looking at affordability, essentially. And these indicators, it's not only a point in time. We don't only look at, the most recent data point, right? We're not only looking at 2025. We go back decades to basically understand how things are changing and how these things are changing with regards to actually the rest of the town. So if we're looking at a particular area within a city or a town, right, we look at this in a comparison to the rest of the town and the rest of the county. So everything is basically compared, right, to what was happening from the previous years and how these changes are actually compared to the rest of the town, the county, or the state. In addition to housing vulnerability, as I mentioned, we're also looking at how the community may be changing in terms of demographics. And I think that with this particular component, this methodology from BATES actually captures that very well, because there are 3 main things, 3 main indicators that we're looking at. First of all, as I mentioned, the racial component, right? What's happening with people of color and other minorities within the community, right? Do we have changes there over the past, let's say, decades? And how does this compare with the rest of the town, again, or the county? What is the educational attainment? I mean, sometimes as the neighborhoods change and as they undergo gentrification, they may see an increase, like in populations that may have a higher educational attainment. That's also an indicator that things could be changing within the community. And of course, we look at the median household income as an indicator of if we're attracting, right, wealthier residents. But again, in comparison, right, to the rest of the town and the county. And of course, the last aspect has to do with market appreciation, right? If property values are changing rapidly and if the market is appreciating, right? And that is a key component, a key factor when it comes to understanding, the market forces that really trigger gentrification. So that mainly covers the overview of what type of data, what type of indicators we use to actually go through these assessments and identify which areas and which groups are more at risk. all of this are actually all of the information that I mentioned is actually discussed under the new guide that we released a couple months ago. That is a part 1 of the Road to Inclusionary Development Guide series. So in this part 1, we are mainly focusing on these factors and how these factors can help us understand where gentrification happening, right? They're indicators of the neighborhood is changing, they're indicators of gentrification is happening, and potentially, right, there may be an increased risk of displacement. So this guide is actually available on our website, but also CCLR's website, and there is an English version and a Spanish version if you're interested in that. And I believe Lujane, right, just added the link in the chat. So as I mentioned, right, these assessments, they may look redundant, but actually they are not, because it's not as a simple process to, let's say, let's adopt an anti-displacement strategy, right? Increase affordable housing, and that's the majority of the talks that we've actually, oriented around, displacement, gentrification, and displacement. Let's increase affordable housing. Well, that's not just an easy thing to suggest, right? Of course, increasing affordable housing would help, but you really need to know, you really need to understand where the risks are within your community. So that's why we emphasize on these needs assessments as a first step, right, to actually understand what type of needs, right, there may be within the community. And this actually includes collecting data on brownfield sites, understanding the demographics, the housing conditions, market trends, but also capturing, right, existing anti-displacement policies that may be that may be in place, from the state or regional counties or the town, and capturing them all together. So that's why they're important. It's actually a study that we go through. It takes several months to actually go through the data points, identify, where the risks are, understanding, what existing policies are there, and how the brownfield site or the brownfield sites can actually fit right into that. So I have here as an overview of the process that we follow. I mean, as you see, it typically takes almost a year to go through, the studies, because we start with data collection, we go through this, the needs assessment study, and then after we complete the needs assessment study, that's when we start the discussion about which anti-displacement policies, right, would be relevant to your community. And of course, everything is summarized in a final report. So here I would like to bring up an example from one of the nonprofit organizations that reached out and is actually participating in the technical assistance program. So this is the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, the OMSI, from Portland, Oregon. And from those of you who actually, familiar with Portland, I mean, Portland has a rich history in capturing, first of all, the level or the depth and also the number of studies that have been published for gentrification and displacement in Oregon, in Portland. They are definitely, significant. So this is an example of how we actually embedded, right, the brownfields redevelopment into this type of assessments. And here, so when we started, the conversation with OMSI, the nonprofit reached out to participate in the program. Here we talk about a 24-acre site that, the museum is actually located on the site. It's the former Portland's General Electric power station, which is actually located across which is located along the east bank of the Willamette River. And if you see that the level of planning and coordination, right? When we're talking about this type of large redevelopment efforts, and we're talking about more than 1,000 housing units with 20% affordable. The proposed redevelopment will also include green space, office, and commercial space as well. So when the nonprofit reached out to actually, work on a potential, first of all, to understand, what are the risks of displacement, if there are any risks, right? And also, find a strategy that can actually be implemented, right, by the nonprofit, right? Which is also something that we'll talk about. Who can actually, implement this type of strategies. So as we started going through the project, right, and as you see here in the map, where this is the central district, of Portland, and OMSI is located there on the, on the eastern part, of eastern bank of the river. We didn't focus only on the area where the nonprofit was located, where the site is basically located, right? We actually expanded the radius to actually cover the entire central district. And the reason why we actually did that is because the proposed redevelopment, right? When we're talking about 24 acres, right, or proposed redevelopment with 1,000 housing units, right? Obviously, the impact of this redevelopment, right, this will not only, right, this will not only impact the census tract where the site is located, but this will expand to other areas as well. So that's why, after communicating with OMSI, we decided to actually expand, the study to the entire, central district. So as we're looking at, different risk, and this is basically, again, implementing the methodology that I discussed before, on identifying, where the risk, right, is with regard to gentrification, by looking at the vulnerability to changing market conditions, the demographics, and also, how is the market appreciating. And here I have in the next slide, just to give you a sense of what type of studies and what is the information that we actually get from the studies. So once we go through the assessment, and of course, again, this is just the final one of the of the findings here. The study is actually many pages long, that incorporates the brownfield aspect and also other existing anti-displacement strategies that exist there. Here, this has to do with the main typology that we actually concluded after doing the data analysis, looking at the market conditions, demographic changes, and housing vulnerability. So as you see here on the map, right, so some of the tracts are actually marked with dark red. The dark red is actually identified as a stage where the area has already been gentrified, right? They have already gentrified. So we characterize this as a continued loss. And in order to identify this, this typology, we actually look at the combination of some of these variables. Again, all the methodology is actually under the, is included in the main guide that we put together, so you can find more there. But I'm just walking you through it, to basically understand what type of information is that we get. And so as you see here, many of the tracts, right, are either categorized as continued loss, or they're orange, which means that they are at the early stages of gentrification. So you see that the entire district, right, the entire district is either has either gentrified or is undergoing, right, early gentrification, which is very important to know. You notice here that the location where the OMSI, right, the museum is located, right, is actually not susceptible. It's categorized as not susceptible, and sometimes with this type of methodologies, you may not susceptible to gentrification. You may run into basically a loop there where, well, you know, we don't have that many residents in the area, so we don't have that much data to actually analyze. This doesn't mean that there are not risks. So that's what I want to emphasize here. So actually the particular area has a very high percentage of renters, but because we see that there was no particular change, the methodology is classifying this as not susceptible. However, of course, there are risks, right? When you see the entire area that has gone through gentrification, is gentrifying, there are definitely risks associated with gentrification, especially when you're planning to have a 24-acre site like being redeveloped. So that's something that we continue to discuss to identify, you know, which strategy would be a better fit for a nonprofit to implement. So transitioning to the strategies, to the main anti-displacement strategies, as I mentioned, is very important to actually keep in mind who, right, what type of entity can implement, right, and what. So, for example, you see like strategies that can be implemented at the state level, regional level, or they may be more suitable for a local municipality, but there are also strategies that a nonprofit can actually, you know, implement. And another key question here where with regards to what type of strategy to choose, right, is actually who are you trying to protect, right? Who is at risk in your community? If we're talking about mainly renters, right, so the suitable anti-displacement strategy should actually target renters. If you're mostly concerned about, you know, affordability and homeownership, right, then you can choose a strategy that is mostly oriented towards homeowners. If you're particularly, let's say, if you think that businesses are mostly at risk within your community, then you can choose a strategy that actually targets businesses. So it really depends, right, on where. That's why we emphasize on the needs assessment, because we need to know exactly where are the risks, who may be mostly at risk, and what would be the main function, right, of the strategy. What is that you're looking, you know, to actually, you know, do. And so here for this webinar today, I've actually together with my team of collaborators, we selected a couple of strategies together with case studies to actually go through. Of course, there are many different these anti-displacement strategies out there. And actually, we're preparing a new guide that will integrate some of that information so that, again, in the context of brownfields redevelopment, but this will be available in the next few months. Of course, I mean, you've heard, I'm sure that you've heard about inclusionary zoning, right? And I'll mention a few things here and why this is actually considered an anti-displacement strategy, right? As a land use planning approach that basically mandates the inclusion of affordable units, right, in areas that consist of primarily market rate development. So, for example, you may have seen this as, oh, well, right, you know, in this particular area, we want to have, you know, inclusionary zoning as including, let's say, 15% of the units should be affordable, right? It's important to be deed restricted. We've seen this a lot, right? So affordability needs to be deed restricted so that it's actually, you know, maintained throughout the years. For households, let's say, earning 50% of the area median income, as an example. An interesting study that actually came across a little while ago is actually coming from Virginia, and they are they have integrated a change in their zoning under their equitable development strategy, where they have set this as a strategy, right, where they identify areas where they have the most community amenities, because amenities are actually related to certain areas where you may actually see more gentrification there. And when we talk about amenities, we talk about transit, retail, recreation, right? And they are basically revising their zoning regulations to increase the number of affordable housing and also low and moderate income housing within this area. So that's a prime example of how inclusionary zoning can be actually, integrated. Some other anti-displacement strategies, again, here we have actually categorized them depending on the type of group, right, that they're actually protecting, right? So we have an example from California that is basically targeting renters. We have an example from Atlanta that is basically oriented towards homeowners, and also an example that has to do with helping businesses, local businesses thrive, and this is from Minnesota. I'll be going over, each one of these examples separately so that we can discuss some of the specifics. This particular strategy here from California, this is actually implemented at the state level, and that's also important to note here, right? As I mentioned, the 3 questions, right? Right, who can implement it, right? Who is the target, essentially, what is the group that you're protecting, right? And what is the main function? So here, right, we have a strategy, right? We have a statewide law, right, that is mainly oriented towards protecting residents within the state of California. So this is the act, right? The California Tenant Protection Act of 2019. It's active for a decade until 2030. And it basically aims to provide long-term housing stability, right? By preventing excessive rent increases and unjust evictions, while maintaining fair standards for both tenants and landlords. So it really requires landlords to have a just cause, right? Just cause to basically terminate tenant camps. And at the same time, it also limits rent increases to 5%, in addition to the local consumer price index. If you're familiar with the local consumer price index, it's basically an indicator that captures what is the affordability, what is the cost of living, let's say, within the community, right? Or a 10% increase as a max. And what is important here to highlight is that they have a rent board that basically any type of suspected rent increase is reported to the rent board and the board can notify the landlord and then basically inform them that there is a law, right? That, there is if the rent increase is more than the limit, right, that they can basically let them know about the law, that the law exists. It's important to know that there are no legal services that are offered, right, from this board, right, and there's no law enforcement. So this is basically a rent board that can the residents, right, can reach out to report the suspected rent increase, and the board can basically, identify the landlord. We've seen a similar strategy, policy implemented at the local level, actually here in some of the New England towns with fair rent commissions, right? So where there is again a board where people have the right to actually, report a rent decrease that seems irrational, right? So this has a very similar, like implementation. Of course, this is at the state level, right? I'm just referring to another example of how this rent board or fair rent commission can be implemented at a local level. This is another example, right, from Atlanta, and you may be familiar, of course, right, with land trusts as nonprofit organizations that acquire and manage land, right, that to basically ensure affordability and accessibility for the community that they serve, right? And this particular example from Atlanta is actually designed, right, to prevent, right, to maintain affordability in order to prevent displacement because of the Atlanta's Beltline. Of course, we've seen a lot of studies associated with Atlanta's Beltline. Now, when it comes to land trusts, I mean, we've been in like numerous discussions where there are certainly a lot of challenges, especially when it comes to, and I'm sure that you've heard of those challenges as well, with regards to basically what's the financial stability of the land trust, and the managerial aspect, who manages the land trust, and some other discussions with regards to land use and zoning. So I mean, of course, I mean, it is a viable anti-displacement strategy, but we also acknowledge that there are a lot of challenges when it comes to its implementation. Another example, which actually, again, through discussions with different towns and different municipal officials, and I have this as an example again from Atlanta. However, this can be implemented right to any type of any type of like local municipality. This particular anti-displacement strategy refers to basically absorbing the taxes, the increase in taxes, right? That may be, right, triggered because of the increase of property values, right? Increase of property values means also increase of taxes. So this is a property tax fund, right, that can serve, right, as a function to basically absorb those tax increases for up to 20 years for homeowners that, of course, I mean, they need to qualify, right, in order to participate in the program. I think, again, from discussions with different towns, this is a viable program because it is relatively easier to implement, as long as, of course, right, you have a champion within the municipality that can actually go through, establishing the fund, right, and of course attract those philanthropic donations, right, that needed to be able to capture those taxes. But I think that, again, this is an interesting approach of like, actually helping homeowners while, of course, I mean, there is the economic growth and development happening in the area. And this particular strategy is actually oriented towards business owners. And this is a great example from, again, Minnesota, where the Asian Economic Development Association collaborated with local artists and small businesses to create the Little Mekong Market since 2015, with the primary function to basically maintain the cultural identity of the neighborhood, and basically supported 80 Asian and also I guess BIPOC owned businesses, Black, Indigenous, and people of color businesses within the area. That's another way to basically, promote local businesses. We've also seen this in a similar implementation with cultural districts in smaller towns. So also great examples to actually, keep your local businesses in the area. And last, but definitely not least, this is a new tool, this is a new ordinance that actually was developed recently for Louisville's Metro government in collaboration with the Boston University and the Louisville Tenant Union. After actually there was a 2019 housing needs assessment that showed a significant shortage of affordable housing in Louisville. And in response to that, this group, basically came together and after, of course, numerous discussions, they launched this, they passed this anti-displacement ordinance back in 2023, November of 2023. And again, with the main purpose to actually prioritize funding, right? Send the funding where in projects that would not contribute to displacement, right? So it basically can deny public funding to projects that have increased displacement risks. And how do they actually do that? So this is a tool that we think that, as we're discussing with our Louisville team, we think that this could be a role model for other communities to actually, implement. Again, it's an ordinance, so it required to actually, pass it. So basically, the tool captures various measures, including demographics, right? So that racial composition, with actually, as I mentioned before, is very important, the socioeconomic aspect, and also market pressures. So again, it is used, right? So from basically, the developers have to use this tool in order to basically calculate, right, if there are any risks of displacement. And the city, right, can actually deny funding if there is a project where they think that there may be increased risk. So we're still investigating, the impact of this tool. So there's certainly, more to come. But we think that this could be, again, a role model for other communities as well. And to mention a few things about our technical assistance program. Our program is open, for if you'd like to receive technical assistance. We mainly, right, so our technical assistance is oriented towards gentrification and displacements in the context of brownfield redevelopment. So if you're looking at identifying displacement risks or identifying appropriate anti-displacement strategies and implementing them, and also integrating, anti-displacement language to your brownfields program, we can also, assist you with that. If you have other questions related to brownfields, I would highly recommend that you reach out to, CCLR, the technical assistance provider for Region 9 and 10, and other TAP providers, across different regions. And with that, I'd like to pass it on to Lujane. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Nefeli. It's been wonderful hearing about the BRADS program and just how many strategies can be implemented and how amazing the work that you're doing is. So yeah, thank you. And like Nefeli mentioned, we have the QR code to receive TA assistance from the BRADS program on the screen. And then we also have a QR code to receive TA assistance from CCLR here. I know it can kind of get a little bit difficult to figure out who to reach out to first. Feel free to reach out to either one of us, and we work very closely with one another. So we'll definitely, refer you to the right resources, no matter who you reach out to first. And then the next slide, we have resources. Devin, if you could, thank you. So some of these resources I've already shared in the chat, but we have some more listed here. Linked is the general BRADS resources website, which will include the Road to Inclusionary Development Guide that Nefeli talked about, as well as a fact sheet, which lists some more case studies as well. And then we also have Community Ownership as a Strategy for Development Without Displacement linked resource, and then All in Cities Policy Toolkit, a toolkit from the Georgetown Climate Center, and then a toolkit from UCLA as well. Like I mentioned at the beginning, these slides will be shared with you within the next week or so you'll have access to all of these links and resources as well. And then next slide. So we have about 15 minutes available for Q&A. Like I mentioned earlier, feel free to put your Q&A, any questions that you have in the Q&A box. One that was one that was put in the chat box earlier from Anstris Farwell. Just to clarify, Nefeli, was the OMSI project entails the demo of all the power plant buildings? Do you happen to know?
So for OMSI, actually, they've gone through majority of the assessment already, and some of the buildings, I mean, they have been demolished. But in terms of the assessment and cleanup, the majority of the assessment has been completed. Some of the areas were found that are clean. And there are some additional, if I remember correctly, there's some additional capping that needs to be done. There is one particular area that it's under private, separate ownership. So maybe that building is still there because there are different pieces. But yes, the majority of the buildings have been demolished.
Okay, thank you, Nefeli. And then a question that was just privately messaged, but I think it would be a good idea to address it to the to all the participants. Is the 5 steps process that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation for the creation of a high-level BRADS document or a hypothetical local project?
That's a great question. So the 5 steps, I mean, we have this as a mini planning document of how we start to engage with our communities in the technical assistance program. So we go through these 5 steps to basically produce an in-depth study for the community. Now, if there is a particular technical assistance request where there's no need to actually go through that in-depth study, I mean, we don't necessarily need to have the 5-step approach. It could be like, a question or a short study, but typically, for the 5-step approach, I mean, this will produce an in-depth study that includes the assessment and also the anti-displacement strategies that are relevant to the project.
So, thank you, Nefeli. And so I am not seeing any more questions coming into the chat, but the attendees, you also have the opportunity to raise your hand if you have a question, and I can allow you to go off mute if you'd like to ask any other questions to Nefeli.
Jane, while we wait for any questions to come in from the audience, I have a question for you, Nefeli. So I'm curious, what you've shared is absolutely wonderful in kind of learning about what to do to assess risks of gentrification from the start of a project. I'm curious, what if someone in the audience already has a project that they have started and has not thought about anti-displacement mitigations or measures from the start? How to get started in the middle of a project?
That's a great question. I mean, basically, I mean, this type of, work, you can start at any point, right? As long as, I mean, of course, I mean, you identify the appropriate strategy. Of course, it is a lot better when you start early, because if you capture this, let's say the risks earlier, then you can also modify and adapt your redevelopment plan for the site. But if the plan has already been solidified, right, you have a developer that they don't want to change any parts of the of the plan, there's still other strategies that you can implement. So even if you are at the last stages of redevelopment and you realize that, oh, what is this going to create here? We're going to gentrify the entire area with this proposed development, right? You can still implement all the strategies, right, to actually mitigate those risks, as long as you're aware of what kind of risks, which groups are are mostly at risk. But there's still time.
That was a great question, Devin. Thank you. And a great response as well. Thank you, Nefeli. So I'm not seeing any more questions coming in, which is totally fine. You all have our contact information as well as oh, perfect. Okay, Michael just asked a question. So the protections for renters is great, but are there also protections in place for landlords when inflation, labor shortages, building supply shortages, etc., cause them to need to increase rent?
So that's also a great question. If I understand this correctly, protections in place when the landlords actually need to increase, the rents. I mean, of course, when there is a market change, this could happen, right? So they may be forced to increase the rent, right? And then what happens then? When it comes to renter protection, I mean, it's mostly, I want to say, like rent control. So that what happens if the rent has already been increased? I mean, of course, I mean, a good way to approach this, I mean, if I'm thinking this correctly, would be to actually work with the housing authority, right? To identify areas, or houses and other locations where you can if you anticipate, let's say, that this increase of rents would actually displace, some people because they cannot afford to live there anymore, then there has to be a backup plan. That's what I'm trying to convey here. That if they're forced and you cannot do anything about this, right? You cannot implement a rent control. Then a good strategy would be actually to identify a way, right, for these people or these populations to live within the area, right, in another housing complex. So I would say that in this case, you need to work with your housing authority to identify that place. That's a great question.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Nefeli. I actually have a question as well, which I'm curious to know. What lessons have you learned from communities where potentially some anti-displacement strategies maybe didn't work as planned, and how did BRADS evolve as a result of that?
That's an excellent question. So far, I mean, and again, we are in the second year of the grant, so we have 2 more years. If of course, we keep our funding, right? So, some of the lessons that we learn is, first of all, our fact that it's not easy, right? Sometimes it's not easy to actually, implement those strategies for many different reasons, right? Mostly like, within the municipality, obstacles, roadblocks that, we see that in many cases happen, right? We've seen all the areas that there is a perceived risk of gentrification, but actually there's not. So that's another lesson learned. So there are a lot. Now, with regards to the implementation, I think that we're still early in the process of identifying the impacts of implementation, especially when it comes to brownfields programs. We're in the process of actually, slowly integrating them. The impact, I think we can have this discussion after 2 years. Once, people have started implementing, integrating, and there are many ways to actually integrate anti-displacement strategies into the Brownfields program. Even, when you have a revolving loan fund, right, you can actually integrate some of anti-displacement criteria on how you select the sites, right? And similar to what Louisville has for the anti-displacement ordinance, you can have something similar but at a smaller scale, right? Integrated within the RLF program. So, I mean, the implementation, again, it's still early to actually be able to tell, what is that we learned by implementing the strategy. So in the next few years, we can definitely have another webinar focusing on the challenges for the implementation.
Definitely, yeah. That's a great answer, though. Thank you, Nefeli. And then I think we have one more question that came in, and then we'll have to end the webinar. So Claire asked, oftentimes a main goal of redevelopment is to grow the tax base to increase community vibrancy. How do you reconcile the need to grow the tax base while also preventing displacement of existing residents? How can the two goals coexist?
That's a great question. To find balance. That's what it is. It's a fine balance, because you certainly want to keep the economic growth, right? You certainly want to, you know, all the towns want to increase their tax base, but at the same time, you also want to maintain affordability. That's why in many cases, like finding creative ways, for example, that tax fund, right? That's one of the ways to actually keep both the economic growth, but also making sure that you're, you know, the homeowners, right, the residents within the community, you know, won't actually, you know, leave because everything is becoming, you know, way too expensive. So you need to find that fine balance between the two. And some of these strategies may be actually, you know, help, right, towards finding that balance. But that's essentially what we want, to find that that fine balance between economic growth and also affordability, which is difficult.
Great, thank you. Okay, so that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you everyone for taking the time to join us for this webinar, and thank you to Nefeli and the BRADS program in general for collaborating with us and putting this webinar on. It was just such a fruitful conversation, and we're really glad that we're going to have this resource on our websites for a very long time. Yeah. Just a note that as you leave, as the webinar ends, an evaluation survey will pop up. So we'd really love to get your feedback on this webinar and anything else that you may need. And then just a reminder that we will send out a follow-up email within the next week or so. Thank you, everyone. Great. Thank you, everyone.